This is Organizing for Leadership, the second unit in the video training series, Being the Best Community Action Board of Directors. We're going to look at 3 strategies a Community Action Board can use to support its leadership of the program: strong board structure, effective meetings, and a complete historical record. Community action boards use the structure common to most of our civic organizations, members, officers, and committees. This structure is spelled out in the organization's bylaws, a document that we can think of as the organization's constitution. Community action boards, however, are unique in that they are required to have specific kinds of members. The Community Services Block Grant tells us what kinds of members must be selected, and it gives us a few requirements, but not a lot of detail about how to select them. It does say that board members should be selected by the entity itself. This is important guidance to keep in mind because the board doesn't want to lock itself into a limited set of representatives by listing specific offices and organizations in the bylaws. As we know, 1/3 of board members must be elected officials or their designated representatives, but they do not always have to be the same elected officials. In the service area of most community action agencies, there can be dozens of such persons and many elected groups from which to choose. It's a good strategy for boards to make a list of all of the possible office holders that they could recruit from and then designate their top priorities according to the number of seats they expect to be available at any given year. This same strategy is very useful when recruiting members from community groups. Groups should be approached because they support the agency's mission or do work that is compatible with it. And you should approach groups that bring resources that will strengthen the organization and its programs. Again, a good strategy is to make up a list of those organizations and set yearly priorities for recruiting when openings occur in those community seats. At least 1/3 of the board members must be low-income persons. Low-income. The CSBG Act also requires that they be recruited through a democratic selection process and that they live in the neighborhood that they represent. So, when recruiting low-income representatives, the board should take a number of steps. It's really helpful to define low-income neighborhoods. Now, this can be as limited in an urban area as a zip code or a voting precinct, or in rural areas it might be a township, a county. It could be multiple counties depending on the size of the territory. In addition to someone who lives in the designated neighborhood, and that is an important qualification, every effort should be made to recruit persons who are actually low income as opposed to persons who work with low income. Boards should also define one or more democratic selection methods for identifying low-income members so that there's a certain standard approach or approaches that can be used in making those selections. The board should, in fact, create a board development committee that is in charge of documenting that members have been correctly selected. That committee would write the procedures that we've just outlined and get the board's approval for them. Another responsibility they would have is to orient new members to the board. They should monitor attendance and make sure or be responsible for filling vacant seats. They should also ask members on a regular basis what kind of training would be useful, and they should create an annual calendar of topics to be presented at each of the board meetings. Effective boards divide their members into committees because committees can amplify the work of the board and they can look at individual topics in much more depth than the group can as a whole. Some of the common committees in community action agencies, in addition to the executive committee composed of the officers, include such bodies as a finance and audit committee. This is extremely important. A program committee, which looks at the various activities of the organization and services. a personnel or human resources committee that deals with how employees are treated and their pay and so forth. And finally, another very useful committee is a planning committee that is responsible for the long-range planning of the organization, what it's going to do over 3 to 5 year periods, not just the current year or the one coming up. It's important when assigning members to committees to try to match their personal and professional skills and expertise with the work of a committee that can make best use of it. As we've suggested, the third part of the board structure are the officers. These are pretty consistent in most of our organization. There is a presiding officer called a chair or a president. There's a backup person called a vice chair or vice president. An important officer is the treasurer, who is responsible for minding the money and the financial condition of the organization. And the secretary, often regarded as fairly unimportant, is actually the historian of the organization, a function that's extremely important, as we'll see in a couple of minutes. The second strategy a board uses to maximize its effectiveness is to organize and conduct highly efficient meetings. Why is that important? Well, that's important because the business of the board is meetings. A board of directors only has authority as a group, and it only has authority in a meeting that has been convened with a quorum of the members. That makes it official, and that quorum is defined in the bylaws. It's an important provision. Typically, it's a majority of the seated members. It could be different, but that's the most common requirement. In addition to the quorum requirement, in some states, the board must follow state open meetings laws, which means they must publicize their meetings in advance and in certain places and with a certain number of days ahead of the scheduled meeting, so that the public can attend if they desire. Boards hold 3 kinds of meetings. These are defined in the bylaws. Regular meetings are those that are held on an annual schedule, usually on the same day of the month. Special or emergency meetings are called whenever a certain number of members or the chair decides that a meeting must be held between regularly scheduled meetings. And the annual meeting, often defined in the bylaw in a specific month, is typically when board members' terms begin, and it is often a case for a special meeting where the accomplishments of the year are celebrated and staff and volunteers are recognized. The preparation for meetings is fairly straightforward. We've already mentioned the public notices which must be issued. A draft agenda is put together before the meeting so that members can prepare and understand what the business is that will be conducted. Minutes from the last meeting are circulated, and materials that help explain the decisions or the deliberations are sent out as well. To conduct meetings efficiently, you need a good presiding officer. You also need to have members understand rules of order. We've all heard about Robert's Rules of Order. We may not know them very well. So you have been provided with a cheat sheet on basic parliamentary procedure, the most common activities and votes that a group can take, and it's very helpful to formulate the business in a consistent manner. The presiding officer needs to move the agenda along firmly, but also make sure all board members have an opportunity to comment and to make their opinions known in support or in opposition to decisions that are made. And finally, the chair must ensure with the secretary that decisions are clearly stated, that the persons suggesting motions are duly noted, and that the vote tally is recorded for inclusion in the minutes. The final strategy that's important for board organization is the maintenance of a historical record. The minutes, as I've suggested, are the official record of board action. They are, in a sense, its institutional memory. So it's really important that minutes be clear and concise, that they are complete, and that there are minutes for all of the meetings that were held. All of the supporting documents that went out in the notice should be included, as should sign-in sheets for people who attended meetings, both members, staff, and guests, and the materials distributed before, at, and after the meeting should be not only included in the board book or archive, but it's very helpful if they are listed on the minutes. That's an easy guide to people who are looking up the history and can then verify whether those materials have been included in the book. A second piece of historical record is the roster. This is a document that is revised as members, positions, terms, and committee assignments change. It is a public document. It is often required by the State Community Services Block Grant Office on at least an annual basis, and probably whenever it is modified. Finally, each member of the board should have a file which includes documents that support their selection, consistent with the requirements of the Community Services Block Grant, the bylaws, and any other requirements that the state office may have included in its contracts. The state CSBG office may in fact have defined what those contents should be, but if they have not, the agency itself should put together such a list and include it in each of the files to ensure that they are consistent and complete. Thank you for your time and attention. This is the end of the presentation in this second unit. Our third unit will deal with the board's responsibility for short and long-range planning.